All right, everyone, we will go ahead and get started since it's now 11:02. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Susanna Folsom, and I am one of the dietetic interns from the UF MSDI program. So I'm currently getting my master's in nutritional sciences, and I'm finishing up my dietetic internship. And hopefully soon will be a registered dietitian. And for the last 4 weeks, I have been doing an elective rotation with Gator Care, and I've been having so much fun and learning a lot. So to kind of close that out, today I will be giving this presentation on eating for mental health in honor of us just finishing May, which is Mental Health Awareness Month. So today we'll be discussing nutrition's role in depression and anxiety. So we will jump on in. This is just my conflict of interest statement, no affiliation with any financial interest in the subject matter today. So our objectives for today, hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll have an increased awareness around depression and anxiety and its prevalence in our population. You'll be more familiar with how nutrition plays a really big role in mental health, specifically for depression and anxiety. And you'll have learned about the specific nutrients, some of the foods, as well as eating behaviors that can potentially help, but also maybe hurt brain function and supporting overall mental health. All right, so starting with just kind of a general overview of mental health, what do we know? So I wanted to open just sharing some statistics on mental health conditions. So 1 in 5 adults in the US alone experience mental illness each year. About 50% of all mental illness starts by the age of 14 and 75% by age 24. So it does seem to be starting at a pretty young age for most people. 16.7% of the US population have major depressive disorder, which is kind of the main form of depression. And then 3.1% of the population currently have generalized anxiety disorder. So both depression and anxiety are very, very prevalent in the US alone. Like I said, depression and anxiety, with those being 2 of the most common mental health conditions. I was actually able to get some stats on Gator Care members in particular, including their spouses and other family members who are on Gator Care plans, to look at their specific behavioral health needs. And in the Gator Care population, about 60.5% of those needs were due to both depression and anxiety from this year. And that's increased from what it was in 2019. So that just kind of shows that, even within Gator Care alone and with UF Health employees, depression and anxiety are common things that people are dealing with. So I just wanted to briefly go over both depression and anxiety, just so if we're not already familiar, just to give us an idea of what these can look like, what some of the symptoms can be. So starting with depression. So this is a medical illness that does have to be diagnosed, and it really can negatively affect how someone feels, how they think, and even how they act, and just their daily living activities. So some of the symptoms with that can include all kinds of varying symptoms, right? So things like changes in appetite and weight, sleeping fluctuations, not as much energy as you normally have, kind of moving slow, lethargy, potentially feeling worthless or guilty, not being able to concentrate, overall just not thinking clearly, and even it can lead to thoughts of death or even suicide. So it's definitely a very serious condition that does need to be treated pretty quickly, but it's also important to seek medical professionals in this, because there are other medical conditions that could potentially mimic some of the symptoms of depression without actually being depression. Some of these being thyroid problems or even some vitamin deficiencies, they can kind of cause the same symptoms. So that is why it is important to seek professional treatment with depression. So on the other hand, with anxiety, so there are multiple types. The most common is generalized anxiety disorder. That's what most people have when they do have anxiety, but there are other kinds such as social anxiety, various phobias. And so overall anxiety really consists of a lot of frequent and intense worry and fear. That's more than the normal level. So kind of just about everyday situations. And there can be a lot of causes to anxiety. It can run in families. It can just be genetic like that. It can be caused by certain medical conditions. Certain medications can induce it. And it can even be brought on by stress and or traumatic events. And so some of these symptoms for anxiety include, again, that nervous feeling, that restless feeling, increased heart rate, start breathing faster, sweating. Kind of think about when you start to feel panicked about something, it's kind of that feeling. Having obsessive thoughts, it can cause, again, kind of like with depression, trouble sleeping, various GI problems, and it can even lead people to avoid things that they may have once enjoyed because of how it now triggers anxiety. So again, you can see that both depression and anxiety do have a really big impact on someone. So kind of going off of that, looking at how these affect just aspects of daily life. As you can see, depression and anxiety have effects mentally, emotionally, and physically on the people they affect. And so these can affect, again, those common activities, just going to work, doing your job like you normally do, your activity level, and not just talking about exercise more than normal, but just, again, those daily activities where you're moving around, walking around, those kinds of things. But they can also affect your dietary patterns and your eating behaviors. And so that's what we're really going to be digging into today. All right, so throughout this presentation, I'm going to have some trivia questions for you guys. And so again, if you don't really know the answer, that's okay. Just give it your best shot. Because we're kind of going to expand on some of these topics, and I just kind of want to see where your knowledge is at before we get to that. So starting with our first question, true or false, nutrition has an impact on the onset and symptoms of depression and anxiety. So go ahead and just type your answer in the chat. All right, see a lot of people answering. Most of y'all got it. It is true. Like I said, nutrition does have more of an impact than we probably think on depression and anxiety, how those play out, and we're going to be talking a lot more about that. All right, so jumping right in with this. So how is nutrition affected by depression and anxiety, right? So we kind of talked about some of the symptoms of those mental health conditions, but how is nutritional status potentially affected? So kind of looking at three realms of this, so starting just with some physiological effects, because like I mentioned, depression and anxiety can kind of affect how we feel physically in regards to our eating and our appetite, that kind of thing. So it can affect someone's appetite, either increase or decrease it. It can cause those weight fluctuations. A lot of times it can cause GI complications, such as upset stomach, and it can even, they both can lead to chronic pain or even increased disease risk. So there can be a lot more physical implications than we assume with depression and anxiety. And when it comes to medications that often are given for these conditions, such as antidepressants, anti-anxiety meds, these can oftentimes increase appetite and cravings, while sometimes others just really lower the appetite, and it just depends on that medication. And so again, same thing with the anxiety medications, and as you can imagine, these changes can impact someone's weight negatively if not really addressed. And then another aspect, and we'll be getting more into this later, but it's how does this affect our eating behaviors, right? So again, we saw the physiological effects, but with people who have depression and anxiety, things can happen along with the appetite changes and potential cravings. It can lead to little enjoyment at meal times, potentially associating certain foods with negative emotions. And ultimately, a lot of times this leads to disordered eating patterns, which can be a real problem. And again, we will be discussing this a lot more later on in the presentation. And so I just wanted to give a disclaimer. We're going to be talking a lot about nutritional aspects of helping with depression and anxiety, but I just want to reiterate that as of now, nutrition, yes, it can be helpful, but it cannot cure mental health conditions on its own, right? So research has shown that what you eat, it does impact, the onset of depression and anxiety, as well as your level of symptoms. So it is important to know how to eat well to support mental health, which is what we're going to be discussing. But I just wanted to reiterate that, again, that cannot be the only approach to treatment of mental health conditions, which this figure kind of shows. There's a lot more that goes into it, and it's really important to seek professional help in all these areas and to get the treatment that is needed. All right, so another question, and this is where y'all can just type in your answers and just general curiosity. Are there any foods or specific diets or just other aspects of nutrition that you've heard greatly influence mental health, things you may have read about? It can really be anything. Does anyone have anything they would like to share? Okay, sugar, I see that one. We're going to be talking about that. Okay, coffee, all right. Okay, I see someone said the Mediterranean diet. A lot of people are saying sugar. So we're actually going to be talking about both of those things because again, there are quite a few various nutrients and foods that have been said to contribute, but it's kind of what's the evidence behind those things. So thank you guys for sharing. We're going to be talking about a few of those. So just going right into the nutrition part of this presentation. So the way we're kind of going to go through these topics, because there is a lot to cover in a short amount of time, we're going to open up with just some specific nutrients that have been connected to brain health and function based on research that's been done. We'll be discussing one particular dietary approach to support mental health. We're going to be looking a little bit at gut health, particularly the gut-brain axis. We'll be going over some disordered eating patterns, as well as talking about ways that we can promote healthy eating behaviors. All right, so just starting with the specific nutrients. So again, there are many that we could talk about because like you guys mentioned, there's so many foods and nutrients that we hear contribute to depression and anxiety. But I wanted to kind of focus on a few where we do have more research and things that could be more applicable. So like you may have guessed, there are foods that have been shown to either lead to onset or worsening of depression and anxiety, but then there's also been foods and nutrients that have been shown to help potentially prevent and even improve those symptoms in people with these conditions. And so these are what we're going to be covering. I won't list them all because we're going to be going through them. So with that, we are starting with added sugar, which is good because a lot of you guys put that in the chat. So yes, added sugar, we all know about it. How bad is it, right? So just a quick little review. Most of you guys probably know this. Added sugar is a type of simple carbohydrate. Carbohydrates are broken down into glucose in our bodies, and glucose is our primary energy source, right? We do need carbohydrates, we do need glucose in order for our bodies to run properly. But the difference is, unlike natural sugars, which are in foods like fruits and vegetables and dairy products, right? Those occur naturally, those are part of the food. Added sugar is added, right, used to enhance sweetness. So this includes table sugar, high fructose corn syrup, things like that, which high fructose corn syrup is not any worse than table sugar. Those are both just forms of that added sugar. So when these are consumed in high amounts, what happens is that blood sugar, right, it can spike really quickly, but then it can drop really quickly. And we don't want it to fluctuate to that extreme because this has been linked to diseases like obesity, diabetes, and even heart disease. So we don't want to be having these extreme spikes and drops. So does this mean that natural sugars are bad? No, right? Like I said, we do need these in our diet, and all sugars, all carbohydrates are going to cause those fluctuations in blood glucose. But the difference is that unlike foods that have those natural sugars that also have so many other nutrients, added sugar does not have those additional nutrients. So that's kind of where that difference is. So obviously the general public is advised to consume added sugar in small amounts, right? In moderation. We know we shouldn't have huge amounts of that in our diet. But how is consumption of added sugars linked to depression and anxiety? So there is some evidence out there that, as you may have guessed, it has shown that there is a relationship between high added sugar intake and poor mental health outcomes. So a high intake, based on some research that's been done, has shown that when people consume more, there does seem to be a higher risk of depression based on how it affects the inflammatory response, which we'll kind of get into more later, as well as just function of the nervous system. It can lead to lower mood, things like that. Its high sugar intake has been shown to cause cognitive impairments, again, some issues with nervous system function, which could potentially lead to worsening of depression and anxiety. And then it was also seen too that having low blood sugar after a meal, which again, if you only have things with added sugars, nothing else, this can cause more of a low drop. This was shown to influence depressive symptoms as well. So kind of knowing those things, it does seem like there is a relationship between having excessive sugar intake, added sugar intake, and onset or worsening of these conditions. So again, this doesn't mean that all sugar has to be eliminated from your diet, right? It's okay to still have small amounts occasionally in moderation. But, you know, if you are wanting to learn how to limit your sugar intake, really wanting to work on that, I wanted to just go over some brief ways where you can maybe try to decrease that in your diet and then add in more nutritious alternatives. So that's what we'll do here. So I just have some little blurbs on just ways you can do this. So I think one of the most obvious, which we all hear about, right, is to, when it comes to what you're drinking throughout the day, the first option should be water, right? If you really do like sugar sweetened beverages, maybe trying to opt for water instead, even things like infused water or sparkling water, things that are still kind of giving you that variation, but aren't having all of those added sugars like sodas do, like sweet tea or even juice, right? Because those do have a lot of added sugar. So that's one way to, maybe just try to make yourself drink more water throughout the day instead of some of those other beverages. Another one is, when you go to the store looking for items that say no sugar added on them. So this could be things like baked goods or even things like dried fruit, because oftentimes these items are just as sweet. And we don't even realize it because we're used to that, all of the added sugar and that taste. So that's another option because a lot of these items still taste really good. If you like foods like yogurt or oatmeal, but are used to having them sweetened with added sugar, just trying to, kind of mix it up, add more variety, add fresh fruit, spices, because not only does this limit your sugar intake, but it also just enhances the overall flavor profile, just kind of adds some more variety into there. And then again, like I said, it's okay to have desserts occasionally, right? We're human, that's gonna happen. But something you could even do with this is, if you're used to having really big desserts, just cutting back the portion size, right? So if you're wanting to have a really large cookie, maybe have a smaller cookie or half the cookie, right? So you're still getting that, but you are limiting that excessive amount. If those make sense. So those are just some easy ways that you can try to limit your added sugar intake if that is something that you struggle with, and especially if you do struggle with depression or anxiety. And so kind of moving on to another part of, again, that sweetener aspect. A lot of people, if they want to limit added sugars, but miss, again, that really sweet taste, we know that there are a lot of sugar-free options of these items, right? So diet sodas, sports drinks, just desserts, there's so many. But we know about all the conflicting evidence regarding artificial sweeteners and how they impact the body, right? I'm sure you guys have heard a lot of those, that they can cause cancer, that they can cause weight gain, all of that, which again, there is a lot of research on both sides when it comes to artificial sweeteners, but we're going to kind of look at what effect do they have specifically on depression and anxiety. And again, this is brief because there isn't a ton of evidence, but there has been an association that's been seen between artificial sweeteners and anxiety. So some studies have shown that these sweeteners, such as aspartame, that's a common one, have led to increased severity of depression and anxiety that's already existing in people. And what is kind of happening in that, it seems, is that sweeteners are blocking serotonin and dopamine transport, which those, I know they sound very technical, but basically those are neurotransmitters in our bodies, and they kind of have that feel-good effect in us, right? Kind of leads to that more positive feeling and mood. So when the transport is lower, this could potentially shift the brain to a more anxious state, kind of going away from that feel-good, right? So again, the research is very limited, but again, kind of like sugar, it seems like artificial sweeteners shouldn't be something that, if you do struggle with mental health conditions, something that you want to be consuming all the time. But again, if you're not wanting to give up artificial sweeteners altogether, which you don't have to, some options that could potentially be better for your overall health include stevia and erythritol. And those are both sweeteners that you can buy just in a normal store. And I say this because they do seem to have kind of a lower impact on your insulin function and your glucose metabolism, as well as your gut microbiome, which we will also be discussing a little later. So in conclusion with that, there does seem to be limited research for how added sugar and artificial sweeteners directly impact depression and anxiety. But as of now, along with just for the general health of everyone, it is safe to say that they are better as something that you have in moderation. All right, so kind of transitioning to our next talking point. I know that these are kind of two questions. You don't have to necessarily answer both parts, but thinking of the term pro-inflammatory, what do you think that this means in terms of food and nutrition? Or what is one nutrient that you think is considered a pro-inflammatory compound? I see a lot of people saying sugar. See some sodium, see some trans fats, caffeine, okay. Yes, see a lot of variety of what you guys are putting, yeah. All right, thank you guys. So yes, so what we're gonna be kind of focusing on today when it comes to, looking at kind of pro-inflammatory, what that means, because again, when it comes to pro-inflammatory foods, we kind of hear that term, and there just seems to be a lot of research coming out, and just kind of looking at various food groups, kind of categorizing foods as pro-inflammatory. So that has been a lot of things such as red meat, processed foods, again, that added sugars, which we do know are kind of a pro-inflammatory food. That is something we know. But again, for a lot of these, there's very limited evidence on do these foods have that same impact in everyone? What does that look like, right? But something that we do know is that a pro-inflammatory compound is omega-6 fatty acids. And so this is something that we're going to be talking a little bit about, just because we do know that this is a pro-inflammatory compound. And so I'm sure you guys have heard of omega-6 fatty acids, but basically these are an unsaturated fat that our body cannot make. Therefore, it's considered essential. So that means that we have to get it in our diet in order for our bodies to be able to utilize it. And so I have the recommended amounts right here. So omega-6s work in brain function. They help promote skin and bone health and metabolism. Because again, even though they are a pro-inflammatory compound, our bodies still need them for function, right? So some foods that are high in omega-6s include a lot of types of oils, so soybean oil, corn oil, things like tofu, a lot of nuts and nut butters have omega-6s, as well as eggs. So the reason that omega-6s are considered a pro-inflammatory is because of how they've been shown to trigger the body's inflammatory response. And what this means is that it can potentially worsen symptoms in people who have chronic pain, so things like fibromyalgia, arthritis, and then even mental health conditions, because there has been an association seen between our body's inflammatory response and the state of our mental health. So kind of looking at what some of the research says about omega-6s and specifically depression and anxiety, it's been seen, like I said, that people who have specifically anxiety-related disorders have had higher inflammatory markers in circulation, because there are several markers that can signal the body is in an inflammatory state. And so it was also seen that there was an increased consumption of omega-6 containing foods, and that was identified as a comorbidity of anxiety disorders. So there did seem to be an association there. And so then in kind of some other studies, a pro-inflammatory diet, which basically just meant that people were consuming a lot of omega-6 containing foods, these were associated with an increased risk of developing depression and also increased the risk of anxiety-induced episodes. So again, in conclusion, like I said, we know that we need omega-6s in our diet. We don't need to try to eliminate all of them, right? And again, there is limited research on what exactly counts as pro-inflammatory, again, with other foods, things like sugar, things like red meat, all of that. But we do know that omega-6s have this effect. So again, we do need them, but this kind of indicates that, again, having omega-6s in excessive amounts could kind of amplify the symptoms of depression and anxiety. So now we're kind of going to flip to the other side, kind of thinking of anti-inflammatory. So this is multiple choice. Which of these foods are high in anti-inflammatory nutrients? And I'm thinking of one anti-inflammatory nutrient in particular. So is it A, chia seeds, B, avocado oil, C, salmon, or D, all of the above? All right, so everybody is saying D, which is correct. So all of these foods are actually really good sources of the nutrient that we are going to be talking about, which is omega-3 fatty acids. So again, kind of more on the anti-inflammatory side, kind of thinking of, okay, if our bodies are in a more inflammatory state with things like depression and anxiety, what could be kind of help tamper that response in our bodies? So omega-3s, we know, kind of function as an anti-inflammatory compound. So again, omega-3s are just a different kind of essential fatty acid. Again, we do have to consume that, and it's needed for things like central nervous system function, heart health. It, again, has been shown to help prevent inflammation, kind of lower that inflammatory response. And overall, there have been a lot of associations with omega-3s and mental health status. And so not getting too much into research because there's quite a lot, but omega-3s have been shown to be an effective part of treatment for depression. It can seem to have kind of those protective effects on brain health, mental health. And it was shown that when omega-3 was supplemented, people who had anxiety had lower amounts of symptoms. But again, this was only with a lot of higher doses, which we wouldn't normally find at a store with supplements you can buy. But low intake of omega-3s was shown to kind of predispose people to developing these conditions like depression and anxiety later in their lives. So just down here quickly, some food sources that contain or that are high in omega-3s, which again, just noting that some of these do also contain omega-6s because again, they kind of go hand in hand, and we still don't really know what that proper omega-3 to omega-6 ratio is, but just being mindful of this. Some of these foods include, again, fatty fish like salmon, seeds like chia seeds, flax seeds, avocados, nuts like walnuts, oils. Olive oil is a common one, avocado oil is a common one. And then there are also omega-3 supplements. So you've probably heard or even take things like fish oil, cod liver oil. But again, the amount of omega-3s that you're getting just depends on the supplement that you buy. So again, just some easy ways that you can maybe add some more omega-3s into your diet. So, say you guys eat red meat every day or chicken every day, right? That's just a common staple in your meals. You could try switching that out a few times a week with a fatty fish like salmon, just to kind of give you more variety and just give you more of those omega-3s. And there's a lot of different ways to cook salmon that's really good. If you cook a lot, if a common fat that you use in cooking is butter, opting for things like olive oil or avocado oil as a more nutritious fat source, because you can use these in things like roasting and sauteing and even in baked goods, and there's still a really good flavor. So those are some other options of, healthier fats that you could opt for. And then another thing is just, adding chia seeds or flax seeds, nuts, things like that to items like smoothies or oatmeal, because a lot of times you can't even tell that you've added them, right, when it's all kind of mixed together, but they just kind of add an extra punch of nutrition with providing those omega-3s. So in conclusion, with kind of talking about the pro-inflammatories and the anti-inflammatories, which we could go on forever about, but we don't have the time for that. So I kind of just wanted to focus on these two compounds since there is a lot of evidence for them. We don't have a solid conclusion on what the ratio between these two compounds should be. We know that we need both in our diet, but as far as mental health goes, with helping to treat depression and anxiety, omega-3s may be more effective in kind of promoting that. All right, so another true or false question to kind of transition us. So at this time, there is no association between micronutrients and depression and anxiety. And micronutrients just refers to vitamins and minerals. All right, so you guys are saying false, which is correct. So there actually is quite an association between several micronutrients and mental health, which I'm going to right here. So I know this is a lot of words, but we're just going to briefly go over some of these because these 5 micronutrients have been the most associated with potentially improving depression and anxiety and just overall supporting mental health. So kind of just starting with magnesium. And again, as I go through these at the bottom, these are some foods that are high in these nutrients. So you can just kind of glance at them as we go throughout, just so you have a better idea. So starting with magnesium, this is a mineral that we need for proper neurotransmission. And again, you see serotonin again, right? That feel-good neurotransmitter. Magnesium helps with proper production of that. So that's how it kind of supports mental health in that way. Vitamin B12 deficiency has been related to a decline in mental health in a lot of people because it is needed for proper neurotransmitter synthesis, proper nervous system function. Vitamin B6, again, we need that for brain health because it kind of helps produce those hormones that can help regulate mood and stress. Folic acid or B9 or folate, those are kind of the names for that. They can help with our mood, our brain function, and similar to B12, folic acid deficiency has been shown to lead to heightened mental health disorders in a lot of people. And then lastly, vitamin D. This has also just been shown to help improve mental status. And something interesting is that vitamin D is often used in what's called light therapy in people with mental health because a lot of you probably know this, but sunlight helps our bodies produce vitamin D, right? Through our skin, our bodies are able to convert vitamin D to the form that we need for proper function of that, for it to do what it needs to do. And so again, the light therapy is used to kind of improve this. And that's how we can kind of improve those mental health symptoms as well. So those are just some of the ones I wanted to mention that seem to be the most associated at this time with depression and anxiety. All right, so I know quite a few of you mentioned the Mediterranean diet as being something that you have heard about when it comes to mental health. So I kind of, if some of y'all are okay to share, I kind of would like to hear, what exactly have you heard about this diet, right? And not even just in terms of mental health, but just in general. What are some of the health benefits? What have you just heard? Yeah, what have you just heard in general about this diet? Okay, good for your brain. That's a big one. Good for heart health, definitely. Yes, so I see a lot of brain health and a lot of heart health. Yes, weight management, that's a good one. All right, awesome. Thank you guys. Longevity, yes, that's another good one. Yes. Thank you guys for sharing. So yes, we're going to kind of jump into some of these things and then kind of talk about, like some of you said, with brain health and with mental health, how this diet kind of affects those aspects of our health. So yes, the Mediterranean diet, again, this diet has definitely gained quite a lot of popularity in the last few years. As of this year, it was actually named the top diet of 2021 by News and World Report. And so, as you may have guessed, this diet originated from the Mediterranean, specifically these regions of Greece and Italy. And this all kind of started when a researcher named Ansel Keys, he noticed that the men in these regions were experiencing a much lower onset of cardiovascular disease, and they were also living a lot longer than men in other sections of the world, including the US. And so through his research, he concluded that this had to do with their diet because they were eating quite differently from, again, for example, what the US population was eating at the time. So through more research coming out, we've really concluded that the Mediterranean diet has so many positive health effects. And so some of these, like I mentioned, are things like lower risk of cardiovascular disease and metabolic syndrome, lower abdominal circumference, improved cholesterol, as well as lower blood pressure and lower blood glucose. And again, we'll be kind of talking about how this kind of leads into brain health and mental health as well. But yes, there are a lot of health benefits that are associated with the Mediterranean diet. So I briefly wanted to go through what this diet really consists of, how it's different from other diet approaches. So the Mediterranean diet is what you would consider definitely a more plant-based approach, right? The main foods included on the diet include things like whole grains, fruits, veggies, legumes, so a lot of beans, chickpeas, things like that, nuts and seeds. Those are kind of the main components of the diet. That's what are pretty much in every meal. And so a lot of times healthy fats are also included on this diet. Olive oil seems to be the main fat source for a lot of these meals. And then they also recommend having fish or another type of seafood a few times a week. Weekly intake of poultry, eggs, things like dairy, that's recommended, but definitely lower than you might have guessed, just only daily to weekly, right? So a lot of times the dairy on this diet does include Greek yogurt, low-fat cheeses, definitely those lower fat options. There's really little to no red meat or sweets on the diet, as you can see from this tiny portion at the top of this pyramid. And this isn't on this chart, but red wine is also something that's mentioned on this diet just because of how it can help promote heart health based on what, again, research has kind of shown. But again, this does mean in moderation, right? So for men, no more than 2 glasses a day, for women, no more than 1. And what's cool about the Mediterranean diet is that it also promotes daily physical activity. So yes, it's a diet approach, but it's also kind of promoting an overall healthy lifestyle. So that's kind of what makes it so popular and very easy to do because it kind of looks at all of your aspects of life and how you can kind of improve your health in those ways. So Mediterranean diet and mental health, right? So, looking at specifically depression and anxiety, there's not as much research about the Mediterranean diet with these conditions, but again, like knowing about, how it affects brain health, looking at more whole food diets, which the Mediterranean diet is considered a more whole food diet. These have been shown to be protective against developing mental illness, including depression. There have been some really cool studies, such as with college students that have followed this diet, and they were found to have about a 40% decrease in their risk of developing mental illness. And so, and just in general, a higher intake of fruits and vegetables, fish, grains, all of these things have been associated with less depressive symptoms. And again, we know that the Mediterranean diet is very high in these items. And we also know that this diet does consist of a lot of anti-inflammatory nutrients like omega-3s. And so again, with these nutrients, we know that they help brain health. We know that they help inflammation. So this could be also why it is effective to improve the outcomes of depression and anxiety. So in conclusion with that, again, more evidence is needed looking specifically at mental health conditions, but the Mediterranean diet approach is overall just an easy way to eat well and to promote mental health. It's a healthy diet to follow and is a more sustainable approach, and is a way that you can maybe make those changes to, again, support your own mental health function. All right, so I know we're moving pretty quickly through these topics, but we are transitioning yet again. So this question is about the gut-brain axis. So A involves the intestine's communication with the central nervous system. B is impacted by bacteria in the gut. C, A and B, or D, none of these. What do you guys think? Right, so I see a lot of different answers. So the answer is actually C, A and B. And we're going to be talking a little bit about that, how the intestine communicates with the central nervous system and about the bacteria in our gut as well. All right, so yeah, jumping into gut health and how it relates to mental health. So the gut-brain axis is a term that, again, sounds extremely scientific, but kind of an easier way to think about it is just to start out with gut health, right? What does that mean? So gut health refers to the microorganisms or bacteria that populate the intestines and just how they function, right? So this is also called the microbiome, which basically just includes all the microorganisms that are living in our gut. And so we know that certain bacteria are needed in our gut for proper GI system function, and we know that the gut plays a really important role in immune system function overall as well. So the gut and brain actually communicate through nerves and various hormones. So it's kind of the central nervous system communicating with our enteric nervous system, which is what the gut is a part of. So this is kind of where that gut-brain axis term comes into play, which again, we could talk about this topic for hours because there's so much cool research coming out about the gut-brain axis. But for the sake of time, what is important to know is that, yes, the influence of, or the function of one influences the function of the other. So, if there are issues going on with the gut, things like, an imbalanced bacteria population growing or anything like that, an infection, this can cause physical and even mental problems because of how the gut relates to the brain. And so, in this little figure right here, this kind of shows, how the gut affects the brain, but then also how the brain can affect the gut, and just what our influence, what some of these, symptoms could be if there is kind of a shift in the balance with those. All right, so gut-brain axis and mental health. So as you may have guessed, based on the relationship between the gut and the brain, the gut it can have major impacts on mental health. Again, if there are problems in the gut, because again, it can impact mental health. So altered microbiota, so not having the needed bacteria in our guts, has been associated with depression and anxiety. But it's also important to note that this is something that was able to be addressed and corrected with adding probiotic supplements to the people's diet. And again, this is just the good bacteria, which we'll be discussing a little more next. So again, having an altered bacterial population doesn't mean that that's always going to be the case. It's easy to get treatment for that and kind of repopulate the bacteria that are needed in our gut. And kind of going on with that, depression and anxiety have also been regulated by, again, those bacteria, but also by what's called gut-derived peptides. And basically, these are just signaling molecules that play a really big role in gut-brain communication. So you can guess that these would definitely affect depression and anxiety symptoms. And again, we know that there are big links between what we eat and our gut health. Everything we eat goes through our gut, so it's going to impact it. So this can affect the onset of depression and anxiety as well. And so overall, it seems like a healthy microbiome, having those good bacteria in our gut, eating to support our gut, this can help kind of lower that stress response in people who do experience those mental health conditions. So knowing this, and again, regardless of whether we struggle with depression or anxiety, how can we support this healthy gut microbiome for having a good gut-brain relationship? So there's kind of two ways to address this in order to promote gut health through what we consume. So those are prebiotics and probiotics, which again, you've probably heard of. So kind of just starting with prebiotics. So these are naturally occurring food components that we're unable to digest, and they are linked to promoting the growth of helpful bacteria, because what happens is when these move through the gut, bacteria, in a way, they feed on them. And this is able to support their growth and overall support a healthy GI function, because the bacteria are able to thrive like they need to. And so a lot of these prebiotics are in various types of dietary fiber, which we know we need in our diet. So this can include, again, beans, there are a lot of fruits, a lot of vegetables, some more than others, as well as whole grains. And so it's really important, to make sure that you are eating an adequate amount of fiber in your diet, which a lot of you, I'm sure, know those recommendations. So that is an important way that you can promote your gut health and keep your gut having the good bacteria that it needs. And then another side of this, like I said, is probiotics, right? And probiotics are the good bacteria found in our gut. Because, say, if you have a gut infection, or if you've been taking antibiotics, which can oftentimes kill that good bacteria, it's really important that you help change or just kind of replace those bacteria in order to get your gut back on track, kind of balance out those organisms. Because like you can see, that imbalance can impact your mental health and just your general overall health. So again, it can help boost immunity and just your GI function. And so there are food sources that contain probiotics, and a lot of these are those fermented items. So, think of fermented dairy products, right? So yogurt, kefir, which is kind of like a yogurt beverage in a way. These have those bacteria in them already, so they go to your gut that way. Other items are aged cheeses, sauerkraut, things like that. And then we also know that there are probiotic supplements as well that are an option. You don't necessarily need to take a probiotic supplement every day, but that is an option to replace this bacteria. So, looking at prebiotics and probiotics, those are some ways through your diet that you can, again, support that gut health function, support the bacteria, and just promote a good gut-brain relationship, because that will support your mental health. All right, time for another true or false question, and this kind of has us moving into our last part of this presentation. So true or false, there is no difference between disordered eating and eating disorders. Great job. So you're all saying false, which is correct. So there is a difference between these two things, even though they sound very similar. So we're going to jump into that. So disordered eating. So what is it exactly, right? It sounds very similar to eating disorders, but it could look the same, but it is not the same, right? So disordered eating really just refers to general irregular eating behaviors. And this can look a lot of different ways. So I have some signs and symptoms here. So things like frequent dieting, kind of being anxious around foods, kind of having more ritualistic attitudes around food and exercise, like guilt and shame, not wanting to eat certain things because you consider them bad foods, kind of being preoccupied with thoughts about food and weight, and just kind of feeling a loss of control around food, right? Just not a positive food experience. So with disordered eating, it can look so many different ways. It could include one or two of these signs and symptoms, or it can include all of them, right? There's a lot of variety when it comes to disordered eating. And all kinds of things have been seen in people that struggle with this, because quite a few people do struggle with disordered eating. And it can have very detrimental effects if it's not addressed pretty quickly. Some of these can be, again, those chronic weight changes, bone loss, GI problems, a lower heart rate and blood pressure. And again, if this isn't addressed, it could lead to a fully developed eating disorder, which oftentimes, unfortunately, does happen. So how exactly is disordered eating different from eating disorders? So Disordered eating, like I said, can look a lot of different ways, and it can look like eating disorders themselves, right? So things like anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa, right? Which are some of the more common eating disorders, because a lot of the behaviors can be the same. So for eating disorder diagnosis, there's a certain criteria that a person must fall into, and this is set by the American Psychiatric Association. So yes, for diagnosis, since it is a medical diagnosis, it has to fall into that. But for disordered eating, like I said, it's possible to just not fall into a criteria at all. To just, even if you struggle with a few of those symptoms but aren't kind of meeting those check marks, you could still have disordered eating. And it is just as concerning as eating disorders, even though it doesn't have that official diagnosis, right? So how is disordered eating related to depression and anxiety? I'm sure you could probably guess. This is something that we see in people that struggle with depression and anxiety. And even if people don't already, if they do have disordered eating, it could potentially lead to a higher risk and prevalence of increased depression and anxiety. So that's another reason why it's very important to kind of address early on. A lot of research has shown that earlier interventions for treating depression were then able to help kind of lower that risk of developing disordered eating behaviors. So what's shown to be effective, and then what's also interesting is that in populations where disordered eating is commonly seen, so in a lot of groups of athletes, both female and male too, it's been seen that anxiety is also commonly seen in these populations as well. So there's a lot of research being done to kind of see what that relationship is, how those kind of go hand in hand. So definitely a lot of cool stuff coming out about disordered eating because of how it's kind of increasing within our population and becoming more of a real thing that people are realizing, hey, this is serious, even though it's not the same as a full diagnosed eating disorder. So if someone does struggle with disordered eating along with mental health, what can be done, right? So for people that do have depression or anxiety, it's important to be aware of disordered eating, that it could potentially occur in people who have these mental health conditions. And it's important to know what the signs look like and be able to recognize them either in yourself or in people you may know. And like I said, it's very important to address these things quickly, right? And it's really important to not deal with disordered eating alone, because oftentimes you're going to need people to help support you through that, to help you kind of move on from those behaviors, kind of resist those thoughts, all of that. And so these are where some professionals come in, so people like mental health specialists and registered dietitians. They can help by really addressing that disordered eating, as well as kind of examining, what other mental health conditions are going on. How are these kind of playing out with each other? Again, just promoting healthy eating behaviors, and as well as just making sure that for these people, their nutritional needs are being met some way, somehow, right? Just kind of supporting mental health status as well as kind of restoring nutritional status as well. So a really big thing to remember, all of that being said, is that for people who do have disordered eating, it's really important to make sure that eating is a fun and enjoyable experience for these people. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, but I wanted to hear from you guys. So, for someone who, say, has these mental health conditions, who may struggle with disordered eating, what are some ways that you could think of that could make eating or like general meal times more enjoyable? What are some thoughts you guys have? Mindful eating, that's really good. Eat with a friend, love that. Going slow, cooking together. Yeah, those are really good. I like that, seeing food as a fuel for your body and not an option. That's good. Yeah, remembering that importance of eating to support your body and your health. Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you guys. So yeah, we'll kind of jump into that now, kind of talking about some ways that we can support those healthy eating behaviors for either ourselves or for people in our lives. So there's quite a few things that we can do to kind of improve the positive eating experience and to kind of avoid those disordered eating thoughts. So a big thing, some of you guys said this, is to pay attention during meal times, right? So kind of avoiding mindless distractions. So one of these could be, making sure you don't watch TV during the eating, because I know, and I'm guilty of this too, it's easy to kind of just turn that on and kind of tune out and just eat, but not really pay attention to what we're eating, right? A big thing we can do is kind of turn off those distractions and really focus on our food. How does it smell? How does it taste? What is this texture? How do I feel when I'm eating this food, right? So kind of taking into account your experience with each specific food, and really gauging how you're feeling during the meal and after and even before. And so another thing, which it may seem silly, but keeping a food diary for people that have disordered eating, this can be a really good way to, kind of keep track of how foods affect you, what did you feel, what foods may have caused more thoughts than others. That can be a really beneficial thing to kind of sense those patterns and to help kind of take control of those thoughts and behaviors. Another thing is just take your time when eating, which a lot of you guys said as well. So just eating slower, really savoring each bite of food, listening to your physical cues. Am I still hungry? Am I full? All of that. And then again, just taking control of those thoughts. If they start to pop up when you're eating, being able to catch it before it affects how you're eating. And just, again, remember to be engaged in the experience in the meal, and keep eating because you know your body needs it. And then some more things is to just make it fun, right? Do things to make cooking and food in general just really fun. So that could be things like experimenting in the kitchen, changing up the recipes, using ingredients that you normally don't use. And then even things like eating meals outside in a new environment, listening to some fun music. Those can all make a really big difference when it comes to promoting really fun eating and mealtime behaviors. And then another thing too is including other people in your meal experience. This can be really helpful to eat meals, with family or friends, just to keep your experience positive. This is kind of a better form of distraction in a way, because when you're engaging with people and also enjoying your food, it can really help distract from those disordered eating thoughts when you're surrounded by people that love you and care about you. And so all of this to say that all of these things are ways that you can overall promote just a mindful eating attitude and experience, which for people with disordered eating, that's very, very important. All right, so we have reached the end of the information, and I know we covered a lot of information in a very short amount of time, and I know that a lot of this can seem daunting since we talked about a lot of specific things. So to kind of close out our time, I wanted to have a little bit of time of reflection. So for you guys to just kind of think about, and then if you feel comfortable, just putting this in the chat. So regardless of whether you currently are experiencing things like depression or anxiety, kind of taking that out of it, but especially if you do experience those things, what are some ways that you think you want to change the way you eat, or just general changes you want to make that could best support your own mental health? Based on what we talked about, what would some of those things be? All right, someone said eating more fruits and veggies, those fish that we talked about, probiotic foods, that's all good. Being mindful, yeah. Just being mindful of how you're eating, what you're eating, your thoughts, all of that. Yeah, that's great. Time for social interactions. Yes, definitely. Oh, I see a question. So if you have time to address, someone asked earlier, what about brown unrefined sugar? Okay. Okay, someone asked that. Oh, sorry, I missed that question earlier. Yes, so kind of talking about the brown unrefined sugar. So I actually did not look at that specifically. Again, I'm assuming that brown sugar, again, that is something that we're kind of adding to our foods. So it is considered more of an added sugar, if you're buying it in the box and then adding it to other things. Again, the unrefined in terms of mental health, I'm not sure how that exactly would be different, or if there are any other health benefits to that, specifically looking at mental health function. But I can get back to you on that if you're curious. I can definitely look into that. All right. Well, if no, okay. Perfect. Okay, so that was Joyce's question. Okay, perfect. Yes, I will get back to you on that for sure. All right, awesome. All right, well, thank you guys for sharing. I appreciate hearing your thoughts and, it's really good to just, think about these things. Just think about, what are some easy changes you can make in your daily diets, right? In just things you're eating, what are some ways to kind of, just promote your overall health, even if you don't directly have depression and anxiety. So thank you guys for sharing. All right, so conclusions. So nutrition's role, as you can see, there's a lot that goes into nutrition and how it plays out in depression and anxiety, how it affects those things, how it's important for both treatment as well as prevention of mental health. And again, it's not the only sole source of treatment. It kind of goes hand in hand with everything else. So as you can see, the foods that we eat, as well as the way in which we eat, right, during meal times, that can both affect and be affected by mental health status. So like we said, our brains, we know that they need the right nutrients in the right amounts to function properly. Depression and anxiety can really affect the way we eat, the way we behave, and the attitudes that we have around our food. So overall, what I want you guys to remember is that it is important to follow the nutrition recommendations that we have to make sure you're getting the nutrients that you need for your health, as well as practicing those positive behaviors centered around mealtime to, again, make sure that you're keeping up your nutritional status, getting the food that you need, and also promoting your mental health to the best of your ability. All right, so just really quickly, I just wanted to kind of talk about some of the resources that are available to you guys as Gator Care members in regards to mental health. So some of these resources that are offered include all of these here. So Talkspace, which is offered at no cost, UF Health Psych, the UF Counseling and Wellness Center is a really good option, as well as the EAP programs. So if you are curious and would like some more information on these, you can go to the Gator Care Wellness website, and they are under mental health services, and there's more information with those. All right, and with that, we have reached the end of the presentation. Are there any last minute questions or anything? All right, well, if there are no other questions, then thank you guys so much for coming. I hope you enjoyed it. I know it was a lot of information, but again, if you have any other questions for me, please feel free to just email me. Again, I sent you all an email, so you should have it. And yeah, with that, thank you guys, and have a great rest of your day.